The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor. In a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense.
What is also clear is that Trump has no economic theory behind what he's doing. And I think that's most disturbing, both to me as an economist and to those who are on the other side of negotiations. I've talked to some of these people and they say, we don't know how to negotiate because the other side is not a normal negotiator. Normally the other side knows what they want. There's a theory about how trade works. That's not true here. It's a different world. So let me give you an example. Trump thinks that trade deficits by themselves, and in particular trade deficits in goods, reflect somebody treating us unfairly. And it's based sort of on a premise that we are better than any other country, so people should be buying more goods from us than we are buying from them. But we are in the 21st century, not where we were in 1950. Services are the major part of our economy. Goods production, manufacturing is 9–10%. What are important? Service sector, tourism, education, health. What is he doing to those sectors? Look what he's done in the last few weeks. He's devastated our education system. The way his immigration people have treated those wanting to come into our country with valid passports, visas, has discouraged tourism. So he is hell-bent at hurting America's major export industry, tourism, and education. I've talked to firms that have thought about bringing manufacturing back to the United States. They say we don't have the logistics, we don't have the supply chains that you need to bring complex manufacturing back. And modern manufacturing is robotic. So even if we brought manufacturing back, there aren't going to be many jobs. So the reality is that his picture of bringing us back to the 1950s, that's never going to happen. But what's going to happen in the meanwhile? We're not going to be able to get those goods that Americans want.
So many scholars and economists have actually been warning since Donald Trump came to office or took power that if the US becomes too hostile to trade with, then what will simply happen in the current world we live in today is people will just reroute and do business elsewhere. Today, this power is not really as concentrated in one place like it used to. But then actually, Donald Trump sold to Americans a very simple idea that the rest of the world was stealing or ripping America off, and that especially China was stealing America blind, and that tariffs, according to his argument, were going to punish foreign countries while making America rich again or great again, as he used to put it. But in this brutally candid breakdown here in this video led by Jeffrey Sachs, he completely dismantles this logic and idea and explains why these trade wars and these tariffs have actually accelerated America's economic isolation instead of, really the opposite, instead of helping it. Now, let's continue to watch a little longer, and we'll be back with some more good analysis.
If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. So he says, you're running a trade deficit. Look, they're all cheating me. But all that's happening is the United States is outspending its national income. And you can look at the national income chart. You can add up consumption and investment and government spending, and you could subtract off gross national product, and lo and behold, what will that equal? Not approximately, exactly. That will equal the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much you spend on goods and services versus how much you sell in goods and services. So the United States runs a current account deficit because it spends more than it produces. Why does it do that? We have a big credit card in the United States. It's called the national government. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No, it got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the US went up and they went down. No, everybody went down because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors, Elon Musk, who paid for his election, became prime minister, he said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt.
The safest thing in the world, apparently.
So interesting what happened. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%
where he
on some
raised
products.
the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now, he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. Now, it raises, if I could, just one last point. How can this happen when it makes no sense? And that, people should understand, we are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing. You raise one final interesting issue, which is that the market recovered about $4 trillion when he reversed. Anyone who knew that 5 minutes before made billions. This is not the cleanest government in the world, I can tell you. I'd be hugely surprised if some people didn't know just a bit ahead of time, starting with members of the U.S. Congress, by the way.
Look, we'll get into the more general issues about protectionism and the end of globalization, question mark, in a minute. But I think what's happening and the directives coming from the White House is such a perfect example of what this panel is about. I'd just like to stay on this just for a few more minutes. Minister, is protectionism always a short-term aim, and does it always come at the expense of the longer-term gain? Donald Trump hasn't said it in public, but apparently in private, during his first term, he was asked about the problem of the U.S. national debt. And his answer was, I don't care because I'll be dead by the time it's a problem. And apparently that's also his approach to the climate crisis. So is this protectionism coming from the White House a short-term fix, which is going to hurt America in the longer term in terms of how it grows?
It's not a fix. It's apparently a quick fix, but it's fundamentally flawed, as Professor has very clearly stated. Look, protectionism is nothing new. If you look at post-global financial crisis, the number of annual trade restrictions have gone up dramatically. In fact, like last year, there were over 3,200 trade restrictions. That is almost 11 times higher than what it was pre-global financial crisis. So this has been a trend, but what we have seen over the past week or two is clearly a new level. This goes beyond some protectionist measures, trade restrictions. This goes into something, an all-out trade war. So that's really worrisome, because if you go back, again, I mean, if you look at 20 years to global financial crisis, global annual trade growth was 2 times world real GDP growth rate. So in a way, trade was the engine of growth. Mm-hmm. Now that engine has been slow. So if you look at post-global financial crisis, global trade growth barely kept up with real GDP, global GDP growth. So that's no longer really one of the kind of like a strong engine. But I think the way things are now, if current state of affairs is sustained, we may end up actually protectionism dragging global growth. It is not only growth. It's really, there are many, additional fallouts from this type of policies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So the answer to your question, this is not a fix. This is a fundamentally flawed, policy perspective. Obviously, countries have choice. They always have a choice. But we would rather, see world moving back to rule-based, multilateral framework, where everyone benefits. I think I agree with Professor. Over 1 billion people since 1990s have been lifted out of poverty, predominantly in Asia. I'm talking about absolute poverty here. And that's largely thanks to, trade and growth associated with that trade. So it is worrisome that we are now experimenting policies that may actually reverse some of these gains, which I think were very important. 1 billion people out of absolute poverty cannot be underestimated. It's quite significant. Now, admittedly, trade do cause geographic dislocations, but the solution is not protectionism. The solution lies more internal sound policies, structural remedies, but also you can deploy tax policy incentives and other things to address, dislocations in regions caused by, global trade openness. So it's not a level, but protectionism will create more inequalities. It will create bigger problems. Already you've got significant headwinds for global growth. Aging population, high global indebtedness, impending climate crisis. So protectionism is going to be yet another big blow to long-term growth outlook. And that's why growth is barely, sustained at 3%. I think the risk is that we will move to a new era where per capita GDP growth will almost disappear if we continue down this path.
Really interesting what you say about protectionism having fallout in other sectors, and we will get onto that, about how it might affect cooperation on the climate crisis, global health, et cetera, et cetera. But let's use one country as a particular example about how a nation can react to protectionism. So we have the US tariffs, which in 90 days will come into effect beyond the 10% that Donald Trump has placed. Let's take two rich countries. UK and Singapore will stay at 10%. Bangladesh and Botswana will both go up to 37%. Laos will be 48%. Syria will be 41%. Lesotho in southern Africa will be 50%. In 2023, the US exported to Lesotho $7.33 million worth of goods. Lesotho in that same year exported to the United States $228 million. The US GDP per capita in 2023 was $82.8 thousand per person. In Lesotho, it was $916. Gentlemen, how does a country like Lesotho deal with the protectionism coming from the US? Minister?
Well, look, protectionism is an external shock, meaning it's not a decision by, the counterparty. It's essentially, so how do you deal with it? I guess you focus on regional integration, as an antidote of protectionism. So regional connectivity, regional integration would be one way forward. So, instead of globalization on a big scale, you focus on how you can deepen and broaden your ties with your immediate neighborhood or countries that are still willing to entertain rule-based trade. So I think that's the only way. Again, this is a major shock for many countries. I think global supply chains are going to suffer. This will lead to, already, I think the risk is that capital will be misallocated. Take us, take Turkey, for example. We are the world's second largest of white goods exporter. We need chips, basic ones, nothing sophisticated. We're not talking about 4 nanometers. We're talking about, 30, 40, 70 nanometers. If we're worried that countries are not going to supply that, even though it may not be the most efficient way, we may have to go into a very large capex to see if we could produce them. We are good at something. Other countries are better at something. So we would rather trade. And this is a very simple, economics, theory. Everybody benefits. So I don't think, X country or Y country, there's not much they can do except to look at, ways in which they could mitigate the fallout from not being able to sell goods to the United States.
But Professor, that takes a long time to arrange because, of course, the shock is immediate. You can't make deals that quickly, can you?
I think the particular tariff rates that Trump announced last week that led to that financial bloodbath are not going to come back. So I don't think we're going to hear again about those numbers after 90 days. 90 days in U.S. time now is infinity. It's eternity. We'll never hear those numbers again. Where did those numbers come from? Something, again, so stupid you can't believe that any country would do this. But the idea is the following. As I said, if you want to know what your trade balance is, you earn some income, so you sell some services to somebody, and you buy things. And if you spend what you earn, you're in trade balance. Technically, you're in current account balance. Now, most of us, I work for one employer, my university, so I run a big trade surplus with my university. And then I run a pretty big trade deficit with the grocery store that we buy our groceries from. And if I have to buy shoes, I run a trade deficit with the shoe store and so forth. Trump's idea, just to add to the craziness of it, is that you should run a trade balance with everybody, not an overall trade balance, but a trade balance with everybody. So you should sell a little bit, you should work a little bit for your shoe store, you should work a little bit for your grocery store, you should go around anytime you want to shop, you trade something. I'll write you an essay if you'll sell me shoes. And you make your living somehow trying to balance your trade with all of your counterparts. Well, this is insane. This is why we have a market economy. You don't have to have balance with every transaction that you do with somebody. But what Trump said was, oh, Lesotho, they sell us more than we buy from them. So they're cheating us. That's literally what he said. Literally what he said. Okay, is it completely delusional or rhetoric? It's delusional, okay? Just so you know. It's weird. But anyway, now, then he calculated a formula. Okay, Lesotho, we have to tax them by the amount to reduce the imports from them so that we have balance with Lesotho. And then they made some absolutely stupid formula that you would not accept in a first year, third week class. It came out of the US Trade Representative's office. They probably were told, do it overnight, the boss wants it. And then they came up with a list of tariffs, country by country, based on the bilateral trade balance. You cannot make this stuff up. This is not it used to be not a Mickey Mouse country, my country. But this is Mickey Mouse. This is not, and I'm sorry, I apologize to Mickey Mouse. He would not do this. Mickey Mouse is smarter than this. So we are in a crazy land, actually, with this. Now, it stopped for a moment. We'll never hear those numbers again. I don't know what we'll hear in 3 months. God help us, really. Because it probably won't have to do with trade. It'll have to do with something else. But we can't normalize this as what's the rationale, how to negotiate, what to do. Of course, 60 countries immediately said, we'll rebalance with you. And the President of the United States literally used the language I'm about to use. I'm quoting him because otherwise I would never say this. He said, 60 countries are coming to kiss my ass. He said that in a public speech, the President of the United States. So this is, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No,
but it's presidential language.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm only speaking at high political terms. So we cannot normalize this. We have to say no. We didn't spend 100 years on 200 years, 207 years since David Ricardo put forward the idea of comparative advantage, okay? And we have been building the trade system since the ruins of World War II for 80 years. And we have been building the World Trade Organization, which the US led the creation of, I think it's fair to say, for 31 years. This should not be normalized to try to figure out what is the theory of this. And it's a more fundamental point, ladies and gentlemen. The United States is a rogue nation right now on many things, not just on trade, but on making Gaza into the US Riviera, on whatever it wants to say. It's a little bit of a rogue nation. For the world to hold together, the rest of the world has to say, we're not going down crazy lane. We're going to be responsible. We're going to go to the UN. We're going to go to the World Trade Organization. We're not going to get into this downward spiral. Because if we normalize craziness, there is no way out.
You mentioned Mickey Mouse, but there's a kind of a theme here from Bloomberg, the news agency, these are its headlines in the morning and the afternoon of Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Tuesday morning, this is madness. In the afternoon, a clown show. On Wednesday, stocks keep falling. In the afternoon, could have been worse. Thursday morning, assessing the damage. Thursday afternoon, Trump blink.
All right, now what Professor Jeffrey Sachs argument? Why his argument here and the entire of this interview is so devastating, if I might say, is that he explains something I believe many politicians deliberately try to ignore. And I say politicians, not ordinary people, not ordinary Americans. And the point is, global trade is not like a neighborhood grocery receipt where every single transaction has, like to balance one for one. Countries trade differently with different partners, and really the balance can happen, but across the broader global system, not in a neatly bilateral one for one. But Trump oversimplified the whole idea, especially when campaigning to look like it's a one-on-one, and now Americans themselves are beginning to realize something uncomfortable, or let's say even MAGA are now beginning to see the truth. Tariffs were never really going to be paid by China, by Mexico, or by the rest of the world. They were paid at the cashier, or they get paid at the cashier by the ordinary citizens. Now, here's the part where Professor Jeffrey Sachs is actually trying to get Americans to understand in the simplest economic terms possible. Donald Trump's approach global trade almost like a businessman keeping score of his personal competition or personal rivalry. If China bought more from China, that's the argument by Trump. Then China, if America is buying more from China than China is buying from America, then for him, he interpreted as losing, or that China was stealing or ripping America off. So his answer was tariffs and trade wars and economic pressures, and that we have already seen, But global economics really does not work like two men trying to settle a debt, maybe at a poker table or something. No, it works more like a giant interconnected highway system. You block one road aggressively enough, what happens is that traffic will simply reroute elsewhere and start using another route, and that's exactly what we are now seeing happening. The assumption from Trump's side, especially, was that countries like China would absorb the pain, would pay the tariffs, would pay the taxes, and something like that. But businesses do what businesses always do best: they adapt. Countries started building new partnership, strengthening alternative markets. For example, we saw that with the situation with China and soybeans from the US. They started looking at Brazil and Argentina, and trading more amongst themselves, like trading with India and Russia and other countries around in Asia, and reducing the dependence on the United States market, if that is possible, in places that is possible, in trying to punish the rest of the world. Maybe Trump might have accidentally or deliberately encouraged the world to slowly start diversifying. And that is in the best interest of the rest of the world, in the least of interest or for America and the American economy. Because if everybody was looking at you and you suddenly let them understand that they can have another option and not you, you might as well be on the losing end of that rope. And then comes the biggest illusion of it all: the idea that tariffs punish foreign countries for free. They do not, and that's for sure. You do not need to be an economist to understand that. A tariff is essentially a tax added onto imported goods. And taxes do not just float magically in the air, waiting for someone in China, waiting for someone in Europe, waiting for someone in Africa, to pay them out of kindness. Companies usually increase prices, and supply chains, they become more expensive as retailers also try to pass down the cost down and eventually to the ordinary American consumer or any other consumer, the one that is standing at the at Walmart holding a microwave or any other household item, or its groceries, because now that becomes the final person, and that is a person, the consumer, who is going to end up footing the bill. So the tariff travels down the economic river, if I can call it so, and finally it lands onto the shopping cart, or in a trolley, because so that means it's the ordinary person that's going to foot down the bill. That's why many Americans today are frustrated at the economic situation in the country, because while politicians kept saying, foreign countries, or Trump kept saying that foreign countries would pay, everyday people are noticing, their own costs of living continuously rising. Many Americans have also spent a lot of time trying to argue that the real strain on the country is not even coming from from ordinary foreign workers or imported goods alone, but from billionaires and the massive corporations that exploit loopholes and avoid taxes and even outsource cheap labor, accumulate, what corporates usually do. They outsource labor and they accumulate historic levels of wealth, while the average American citizen or the average citizen in that country is left struggling every other time. Americans have repeatedly said, if you want more revenue, more tax, you can as well go for the ultra wealthy. But really, politically, it's much easier to point at someone else, the rest of the world, to point China for Trump, and other than confronting the powerful corporate interests, sitting inside your own economic system, because they are the ones who run, or they are the one who benefit actually from exempting taxing the ultra wealthy or these big corporates that are exploiting the system. And that is the deeper tension, underneath this whole debate, actually. Because in today's multipolar world, I usually say isolationism, or this isolation economic tactics, becomes extremely dangerous for anyone who wants to shut off the borders from the rest of the world. That's for sure a fact. Countries now have a lot of options, actually. The world is no longer orbiting around, one uncontested superpower. If America becomes like too hostile, too unpredictable, and too expensive to trade with, many nations will just, will not stand waiting for permission, or, at being at the mercy. They will just reroute to someone else who can offer the same service at a less hostile, conditions. And once global trade reroutes, or the routes begin to shift permanently, reversing that damage becomes far harder than starting that war in the first place. Yeah. I don't know if Trump understands this concept, or he understands but he doesn't care, as long as he is making something for himself. Yeah. Now, really, that's my take, or something that I've gotten from this really wonderful interview here. Let me know what you think, what you've learned. If you agree or perhaps disagree, let me know in the comment section below. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.